Uh, so I guess we'll get started. I'd really like to thank everybody for coming today. This is a whole lot more than I was expecting, which is absolutely terrifying to me. Uh, so I'm gonna start with the thank yous. We'll do this at the beginning so that I don't forget. I'd also like to thank the Archives and Research Collection Center and Deb specifically for sort of piloting and pioneering the comic collection here at Western and seeing the academic value in it and letting me play with it. I'd like to thank the history department for, oh, sorry, before I thank the history department, I'd like to thank the library for setting this talk up and doing things. I'd like to thank the history department for everything, honestly, and specifically Professor McEachern for supervising and giving me the latitude to be as weird as I possibly can be. Um, I really want to thank my wife and my son for being my wife and my son, and for putting up with me and giving me all the support in the world. I'd really, really like to thank Eddie Smet for his donations, for all of the help and advice that he's been able to give since I've started working on it. And last but not least, certainly not, is I'd like to thank Ivan Kochmarek and John Bell for all the research and work that they've done that have laid the groundwork for everything that we're about to see today. So I can say that my time here at Western has been incredibly privileged, particularly with the people that I've been able to meet and call friends. And one of my closest and dearest friends when I was an undergrad was an Indigenous student, and her and I spent a lot of time together and a lot of really good conversations that influenced the way that I thought about things. And we did have a lot of conversations, whether we were flying to different countries or flying across this country or just sitting in the Ock Rock with coffee. And these conversations really affected the way that I think about truth and reconciliation. And so I'm going to give her credit for this because it's fair that I do so. I'm also going to give credit to R. Stacy Laforme, the Ogima of the Massasaugas of the Credit, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. When I was in Sudbury for an USA project, they had done an internal policy paper where he was quoted, and what he talked about was land acknowledgements. And one of the things that stuck with me about it, I'm going to paraphrase him a little bit, was that it should not become a perfunctory mea culpa and then disregarded, that we should be actually thinking about it, and that these should be personal and how we connect with the land and with the people. So I'm going to give him the credit, and I'm going to try. My friend and I had some really good conversations about spirit trails, and these are the long trodden paths that our ancestors still use to this day. These were the paths that connected hunted grounds, waterways, and fishing spots. And they connected to the places where we rest our heads and then where eventually we'd rest our bones. Um, and the land that we're on right now has long been traveled by the Anishinaabeg people, the Haudenosaunee people, the Lenape people, and the Chunoktukton people. I apologize. And they would use the Deshkanzabi, what we call the Thames River, that way, um, as a trade route with their neighbor, as a source of food and fresh water, and its floodplains, which Talbot College and Delaware House sit on. They would use these as hunting grounds. And these places are still walked by the ancestors today as much as they are by the students making their way across campus. And during these conversations, I remember thinking about my mother and how she would talk about seeing ghosts along the River Erin and how my people would walk the rivers and eat and go. And how, as we're standing here, we're about to talk about Canadian heroes, including Nelvana of the Northern Lights, an Indigenous character, a very rare one, particularly in the 40s, that it's important to not acknowledge that we walk the same paths that the ancestors did and still walk today. And even though their children and grandchildren were denied walking those paths, that today, perhaps if we think about it a little bit more, we can maybe walk those paths together. And that's just something that's important to me. Anyway, I feel awkward with stuff like that. I'm sorry. So we got a timeline that's going to try and keep us on track. I say try because it's me. So we're going to start off in the pre-war era. And there's a whole bunch of things that happened in the pre-war era. We're going to go back as early as 1933, maybe a little bit earlier. There were a whole bunch of Canadians in the comic book and cartoon comic strip industry. Particularly highlighted, we can talk about Ted McCall. He's going to show up a lot. And Ted McCall wrote for the Toronto Evening Telegraph, and then it was syndicated to a bunch of different places, two comic strips, particularly Men of the Mounted, which sort of fed into the American fascination with the pristine Canadian wilderness and the honest Mounties and things like that. And then he, more importantly, from 35 to 39, did a comic strip called Robin Hood and Company. And for some reason in 39, the comic strip was canceled. Something happened. The other sort of major thing that I want to point out that happened in 1939, particularly June 1939, is Action Comics #1. This is the most important comic book in history. It wasn't the first, it wasn't anything, but this changed everything. Superman changed how people perceived comic books. And what's really important when we talk about Canadians and Canadian comic book history was that he was created by Jerry Siegel, who was an American, and Joel Shuster, a boy from Toronto. He was the artist. He created how Superman looked and the stories from there on. Canadians have been a part of the comic book industry since its inception. So we move forward a little bit more and some things happen. So in 1939, the American industry is still dominating the Canadian market. We see Cyril and Jean Bell form Commercial Signs of Canada Limited, and they buy a big giant printing press and start printing stuff. Ted McCall's Robin Hood gets canceled, and then Germany invades Poland. Great Britain and France declare war on Germany. Canada, separately, declares war on Germany September 10th, 1939. And it's the war. Canada's economy transforms to total war. Its society transforms to total war. But comic books are still being brought up. Luxury items are still being brought up into Canada. But starting in 39, probably before, but it becomes highlighted in 39, and then through into 1940, the trade deficit between Canada and the US is massive. They are outstripping us. I believe the numbers are somewhere like we're buying $900,000 worth of stuff. They're buying $300,000 worth of stuff. The trade deficit is massive. And we're watching American dollars go out the door, particularly for things that the Canadian government says maybe Canadians shouldn't be buying from the Americans. So I will move over here because it's on this side. There is a debate in Parliament, and Canada passes the War Exchange Conservation Act. It's passed on December 4th. It goes into effect December 6th, 1940. This restricts or bans the outright import of luxury items. For our conversation, this includes American comics, as well as the means to print them. So the printing plates and things like that are completely banned from being imported to Canada. This creates a massive deficit. We don't have numbers. As I was saying, Captain Marvel is the biggest hero in the US. He's selling about 1 million copies a month, just in his comic. Running the numbers in Canada, if we just look at what's being produced, it would equate to about a $90,000 a month deficit in 1940. This is a big amount of money, and people like money. So we move forward in our timeline a little bit. One thing I do want to highlight, sorry, it's down there at the bottom, I missed it, is terminology. When you start talking about comics, Canadian comics, you'll hear two terms talked about. If you ever hear me talk about it, I use WECA exclusively. WECA is the War Exchange Conservation Act. The other term that you'll hear older collectors talk about is Canadian whites. And then you have to have a conversation about what Canadian whites mean. Canadian whites is very simply because they were printed black and white on white paper. However, if we're talking about the 40s, it's a little bit of a loaded term, and we're now starting to transition to WECA. It's just a little bit of an easier one. You don't have to go, you'll only hear me talk about WECA, but if you hear people talk about Canadian whites, it's the same thing. All right, moving through to 1941, there were no comics on the stand. Thank you. In January of 1941. So World War II dominates the life in Canada. Canadian troops are actively engaged in overseas, and wartime propaganda, morale building, and nationalism is permeating the culture. We're going rah, fight the Nazis, the whole deal. See if that gets in trouble on the streaming. it's weird doing historical stuff and having to worry about whether or not it gets blocked on YouTube. Uh, so this is what's going, this is the world that we're living in. On the comic book side of the world, um, you really need to know that the comic book industry emerged from this thing. It is a nationalistic, in some ways propagandic arm of it. There is the money making, the capitalistic side of it, but this is also seen as a way of working with the wartime economy and the wartime culture. Companies rushed to fill in the void that was left by the American comic book industry pulling out. So right off the bat, we got three. First one out of the gate, Maple Leaf Publishing from Vancouver, from the West Coast. Predominantly, it's Vern Miller. He works with a couple of other people to, sorry. It's almost like I wrote this stuff down. Vern Miller, who would also call himself Uncle Vern for the entirety of the comics, whenever you see an editorial, it's always signed off by Uncle Vern, works with Harry Smith to found Maple Leaf Publications. And they get Better Comics #1, this guy right here, to the stands for the first week of February 1941. That's why we're doing this today. It's the 85th anniversary of the first Canadian comic ever. Vern would act as an artist and a writer for the early issues and then take on the role of editor, art director, spokesperson. He would respond to kids' letters. Vernon Miller was very, very invested. And he was the first to the gate. Right after some other comics that would come out from Maple Leaf, so Better Comics, then Lucky Comics in June of 41. They initially called it Name It because they had a write-in campaign to name the comic book, which would eventually be called The Rocket. From November, December of 1944, and then Big Bang Comics in 1941, I apologize. We also have the Iron Man. He is the first Canadian superhero, asterisk. What's really interesting, he's not Tony Stark, he's not anything like that. He's actually very much akin to Aquaman or Namor the Submariner. He lives in a undersea kingdom that's been decimated, and he meets a couple of Canadian kids, and they go, hey, there's some really bad people doing stuff in the sea. And he goes, okay, we'll fix that. And that's the Iron Man. Then we have Hillborough Studios. So Hillborough Studios is founded by Adrian Dingle and Andre and Renee Kuhlbach, sorry. All three of them were unemployed artists in Toronto sitting around going, hey, we could make a comic book and make some money and not be unemployed. And they do. They create Triumph Adventure Comics. That's the only comic produced by Hillsborough Studios at the time. It does, however, feature Nelvana of the Northern Lights as their primary character. There's a bunch of other things in there, but Nelvana is the standout, probably because of Adrian Dingle's art. She is also Canada's first superhero. Triumph Adventure Comics comes out in August of 1941. But Nelvana is also Canada's first Canadian superhero. And the reason I differentiate these is the Iron Man is Canada's first superhero because he was created by a Canadian. Nelvana of the Northern Lights is the first explicitly Canadian superhero. She is from the North. She's Inuit. She's the daughter of the King of the Northern Lights. Her brother turns into a dog whenever white men are around. As a matter of fact, Adrian Dingle based her after a conversation with Franz Johnson, also of the Group of Seven, who had been up to the Arctic, specifically the Northwest Territories, done some work with the Inuit, not what they called them at the time, but be aware when you're reading the stuff, and was inspired by an Inuit legend. However, as Adrian says, they didn't want an old woman with long hair, with long gray hair and stuff like that. So he's like, we shortened her hair, we made it black, and we threw her in a miniskirt. We did the best that we could. But most importantly, everything had to be very patriotic, and she was a patriotic Canadian hero. And then over here, we have Anglo-American. I will fully acknowledge my bias. I love Anglo-American. They started out with Robin Hood #1. Why? Because Ted McCall still owned the rights to the characters and still had the printing plate. So the comic book market imploded, and he went, I can make this right now. He actually was relatively grumpy the fact that, despite the fact of having all of this, Vern Millen still beat him to the stands by 2 weeks. Out comes Robin Hood and Company #1. The first issue is in what would be called a tabloid. It was still a fold over paper, though it was like a magazine that folded. And it was 4 blocks. They would then go on sometime around issue 2, transition to your standard comic book format, and they would be playing with the layout a little bit more. Some other things that happen, I didn't bring them with. Oh, we're going to talk about them in a second. Were the illegal WECAs. We'll get to those in a second. There were 4 of them. July 1941 sees Freelance, the 3rd major character in Canadian comic book history. Ted McCall wasn't just happy with Robin Hood, with doing a historical character. He wanted something modern, something that was to deal with the propaganda and the war machine at the time. So he created Freelance. Obviously, his work with historical stuff. Freelance is a knight who owed no allegiance to a king or anything else and sold his work out. Freelance is an unknown soldier in the unknown character in the theater of war. He'd be more of a gentleman spy, gentleman thief, and he'd run around and thwart Nazis. Grand Slam Comics and 3 Aces were anthology stories, anthology comics with characters like Terry Kane, the Crusaders, the Purple Rider would all appear in these comic books in the early issues. And they appeared in September and October. So by the end of 1941, we've got 9 comic books being produced by Canada over the course of a year after nothing anywhere happening before then. Yeah. So we have the illegal WECAs. One of the fun things that I've always found about Anglo-American is the fact that, or one of the things you need to acknowledge first, sorry, before I go into there, one of the things you need to acknowledge is that while comic books were not allowed in Canada, we were still getting movie reels or movie serials and radio shows featuring characters like Blue Beetle, Captain Marvel, all of these American superheroes. So they were still coming up. As a matter of fact, we have in the archives comic strips from the London Free Press in 1940s that still have Superman strips in them, but we couldn't get American comic books. So Anglo-Americans, like, these guys are still making a lot of money. Kids are still hearing about it. We really, really want to bring up American comics. Big thing you need to understand about Golden Age comics, they're anthologies. They have multiple different stories throughout the issue. Freelance would always have freelance stories, but there'd be 4 of them. WECA brought up these 4 comic books from Fox Syndicate. Fox Syndicate had Blue Beetle, one of the biggest characters of the time. They took the first 3 stories and shuffled them to the back and printed the covers in black and white and said, haha, it's not a direct reprint. And then they never did it again. We don't have any evidence that WECA came down on them or anything of the law because we don't have any records from Anglo-American, but they never did it again. So it's a fair assumption somebody came along and said, don't do that anymore. However, Anglo-American would not be deterred. We'll continue on with that in a second. So that brings us to the end of 1941 and moving into 1942. And we're going to talk about sort of the development of the comic book industry because a bunch of major things happen at this time. Happening in the world. Canada's fully mobilized for overseas deployment. Rationing deepens, war crime propaganda becomes more pervasive. The popular culture, particularly seen in the comic books, is morale building, pro-Canada, pro-Allied, anti-Nazi, obviously. There's another major event that happens at the end of 41 that we'll talk about because it's so culturally significant, particularly in the comics. It deserves its own space. Commercial Science of Canada begins producing their comic books, starting with WOW #1. Eventually, Hillsborough gets absorbed into them. They become Bell Features. Anglo-American signs a deal with Fawcett, and Educational Projects enters the conversation. So moving on with that, here's our guys. We're still working with Maple Leaf. They're still going on. They're the smallest of them. Well, they're not the smallest, but out of the big 3, they are the smallest. They're doing regional stuff. They're less focused on expansion and more focused on just having fun, which is the weirdest thing to say, but their comic books really reflect them trying new and different things and trying ways to connect with kids, and that is their focus. Commercial Signs then absorbs Hillsborough, becomes Bell Features. So Commercial Signs produces WOW. Hillsborough does not have enough money to produce Triumph Adventure Comics #3. Um, Bell particularly recognizes that they need the talent, and the guys at Hillsborough are incredibly talented. So he's like, come on over, and they form Bell Features. That's where, so Triumph Comics, #3 is published by Bell Features. By the end of the year, they're publishing 5 full titles, which is pretty good. Anglo-American signs a deal with Fawcett, which we'll talk about in a second, to bring up American superheroes to Canada. And by the end of 1942, they're producing 7 comics, all 64 pages. They don't even have their own printing press, but they've created their own process and they're just going at it. They're having a great time. Educational projects enters. They're set up out of Montreal, and their whole goal is to be educational. They're going to tell true stories. They're going to tell stories about Canadian heroes, VC winners from World War I and the Boer War. They're going to talk about the machines of war that the Allied and the Axis used, things like that. And it's all factual. There's no fiction in it whatsoever. But because there's nothing else to buy, people buy them. So a couple of things we want to talk about. The first one is Johnny Canuck. There's some conversation about who was the most popular Canadian superhero or Canadian character at the time. And Johnny Canuck comes up a lot of ways. Some more recent research indicates that maybe not so much, but he's still a very important Canadian character. And yeah, he's punching the mustache man. The story goes that Leo Bichel was in a store buying some comics, and one of the financiers for Bell Features, I have his name, John Erzin, was sitting there, and Leo was just bashing the art from Bell Comics. And John Erzin goes, okay, if you think you can do better, do better. And right there, Leo fleshes out, draws a page of a comic book showing an action scene. He was hired the next day, and over that night, Johnny Canuck was created. Johnny Canuck was created on a bet, which I think is kind of fun. Leo also talks about the fact that, well, Michelle admits that Johnny Canuck is in a lot of ways himself. He put a lot of himself in there. He got to fulfill, he uses him to fulfill a lot of his wartime anxiety as a young man. He shows it as a way of doing the things that he can't as a young man. He also threw in his high school friends, and more importantly, his high school bullies were a lot of the villains that he fought. So it's an interesting thing there. On the other hand, we have the Anglo-American redraws. So as I said, Captain Marvel, most popular character in America. He's beating out Superman hand over fist. If you ever hear it, Superman at the time and still is called the Big Blue Boy Scout. Captain Marvel was called the Big Red Cheese. And they're selling 1 million copies of just Captain Marvel adventures in the US. And Anglo-Americans like, we're still getting the stuff up here. We like some of that money. So they sign a deal with Fawcett to bring up the scripts and then had everything completely redrawn. So if you look and if you're bored, the words are exactly the same between those two pictures. And they are completely redrawn for one. I remember when I first started this sort of journey in comics, I talked with Alan about the redraws, and he asked me, are they just traces? And I didn't know. They aren't. They are completely redrawn. There's a lot of sort of differentiating and storytelling that can be going on there. But I just find it funny that Anglo-American could not let go of bringing up the American comics and set up this whole production run. So to talk about it, there's some conversation that Ed Furness, who is now the art director of Anglo-American, worked for Disney. He himself never said that he worked for Disney, but he took a lot of inspiration from the Disney methodology. So there was a primary artist who drew the main characters. There was a secondary artist who would draw the secondary and background characters. Then there was a third artist who would draw the backgrounds and other things. Then you had your letterer come in, and it was just a production line. And Ed Furness would say that if you could hold a pencil in Toronto, they would hire you. They were raiding the art colleges in and around the GTA, just trying to hire people. And one of the things that, because this was the wartime, and an interesting thing that's come out about it was they were the largest employer of women in the comic book industry probably ever until modern times, just the sheer number of people that they hired. But they just had an assembly line. It's how they were able to do 7 comics all the time. All right. So there was another major event. That would be December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Canada joins the war that day. And one of the things that you start to see in the comic books, and there's a reason why I picked a redraw of a Spy Smasher of an Anglo-American comic, of a Fawcett comic, is you start to see the racism, the hatred towards Japanese people manifest very, very quickly in Canadian comic books, arguably even more than we see in American comics. The transition in Canadian comics, there were always Asiatic villains. They were always present. But the second Pearl Harbor happens, they transform to Japanese instantly. And from then on, they are one of the predominant villains of Canadian comics to the end of the war. And they are not depicted well. So the other major transition that we see in 1942 is this transition to a Japanese-centric villain along with the Nazis. Back to the timeline. We're moving into 1943, and things get a little bit fast at this point, simply because things go really, really well for everybody, and there's not a lot to report. Everything sort of stabilizes for the comic book industry. In the real world, the war has reached a turning point. We're looking at the Battle of Stalingrad, North Africa, and Italy. The wartime economy is fully mobilized into total war. And we see a lot of really heroic narratives, these really good characters, Freelance and everybody, and these, doing amazing things and making the Nazis look bad. On the comic book side of things, everything's great. It's really weird to say, but things were going incredibly well, incredibly smoothly for everybody. The biggest sort of thing to happen to the Canadian comic book industry in 1943 is the really ramping up of clubs. And this is sort of one of the weird things. We'll do them in a second. One of the weird things for me as a parent is that the comic books also wanted to be serving as this sort of pseudo-social network. They encouraged kids to write in, create pen pals, and correspond with each other. One of the things that came out of that is that they would publish the child's name, their address, their postal code, the whole deal, how to get a hold of everybody in the comics. And from there on in, particularly the Canada Jack Club and the Active Gym Club in Bell features. Interestingly, Anglo-American never featured a club. The other three had clubs. Even F.E. Howard, when he would come in, would try to start a club. Anglo-American, no club. But there are just lists and lists of children's names, where they lived, their ages, the whole deal in these Canadian comic books. And as a parent, I find that a little weird. Different time, I understand. But the other thing that sort of happened is F.E. Howard really, really, really wanted to get in the Canadian comic book industry. But he just kept trying to reprint American comics. And his idea of a redraw, he was like, hey, Anglo-American's getting away with this. That's the only redraw that he did. The cover is exactly the same from the American one. The only thing he did was replace the shields red, white, and blue with the Union Jack. He got 2 issues published before he got shut down, and he tried again in 44. He got 1 issue out at that point. So he keeps trying, though, and he will show up at the end of everything. But the most interesting thing is he tried. I mentioned, no, okay, we're going on. Cool. So we're moving on to 1944. And again, this is sort of really, really quick because things are still going really, really well for the Canadian industry. There's no new comics coming out. Like, nobody's producing any new titles. They've sort of stabilized. They're getting their feel for the world, or the thing. However, we do start to see some shifts at the end, and as D-Day happens, liberation of the West, there are a few social things that we start to notice that starts to creep into the comics, and particularly the readers. The biggest thing that we can sort of start to note is you do start to see the war fatigue setting in. You're starting to see less war stories. Even Canadian heroes, where their big thing was Canadian war heroes, they start shifting to the Boy Scouts, the YMCA, other things. The war fatigue is really starting to set in. Even the instances of Japanese villains are starting to wane because people are just getting tired of it. And the Canadian comic book industry takes note of this, but they still are like, nah, things are great. The comic book industry is going well. We're going to run with all the comics. And that's 1944. There's not a lot to be said other than everything was going great. So that brings us to 1945. A couple of major things happen in 45. Couple, things. Germany surrenders, VE Day, and then Japan surrenders and VJ Day. And then we get a rapid cultural shift. We move away from the wartime urgency. The rationing is released, and while WECA is not fully repealed by this point, the restrictions on WECA are significantly loosened. And this has a major effect on the Canadian comic book industry. So we'll check in with our guys. Maple Leaf remains active, but they are massively in decline. Their sales are going down. Their creativity is waning. They're actually they're having a hard time finding artists because they're moving to other areas. John Bell talks about the fact that they were always sort of a smaller scale, and because they were located on the West Coast in Vancouver, it made it harder for them to distribute and sort of be connected. Bell Features, they're really, really determined to stay in the market, but their quality is declining. They're really, really leaning in on Adrian Dingle, and he's starting to feel the fatigue out of it. Additionally, to sort of support this and deal with it, they start flirting with and bringing up reprints of American comics. So their comic books start seeing American reprints in them. Anglo-American, on the other hand, they're doing great. They're still doing fantastic. As a matter of fact, they're doing so well, they start shifting to color production in 1945. The Globe and Mail has bought a couple of color printers. And that's who they were working with on printing it. And they're like, do you want to do color printing? And they're like, yes, absolutely. They mess around with their numbering a little bit, but they go full color printing. The smaller comics, but they're still selling incredibly well. And because of that, you actually see Ted McCullen and Ed Furness switch Anglo-American. Volume 4 of the Captain Marvel of Wiz Comics and Spy Smasher stop being redraws. They actually refocus all of their artistic talent to their original characters. So Three Aces, Grand Slam, Freelance, and Robin Hood are now all original Canadian content again. The Three American stuff is just straight reprints of the American stuff. And then, unfortunately, educational projects. For some reason, when you start bringing in American superheroes and stuff like that, nobody wants to buy educational comic books, and they are the first of the big four WECA comics to collapse at the end of 1945. Yeah. And then we hit the end. And I wish there was a happier ending for this tale, but unfortunately there isn't. I mean, for the world, it's a wonderful time. There's no more war. Things aren't bad. Canada is fully demobilizing. Troops are returning home, and by the end of 46, WECA is completely lifted. The government admits that this was a mistake, and things happen in the next year. But at the end of 46, during 1946, the writing is on the wall that American comics are going to be returning to the Canadian market. Yeah, that's what I said. Oh, apparently not. So a couple of things happen. By May, Maple Leaf has fully folded. They just cannot keep up with it. They cannot do anything. By February of 1946, Bell Features is fully American reprints. They're all just American comics with Canadian covers on it. They like to say original Canadian covers, but a lot of the art is recycled from their previous comics. Anglo-American drops their deal with Fawcett because Fawcett's bringing their own comics up. However, they do work with Fawcett to attempt to enter the American market. They are the only Canadian comic books to ever enter the American markets. We do know that Freelance and Three Aces Three aces, were sold in Ohio and Seattle. Why those? I don't know, but we know that they were sold there. Unfortunately, it's just not sustainable. And by the end of 46, there are absolutely no Canadian publishers anymore. Anglo-American technically goes under. They reemerge again at the end of 47, but they're just producing American comics. We see F.E. Howard return to the market, and he's producing American comics. The other one is Century Publishing that did a lot of work here in London. But again, they are just straight American reprints. These Canadian publishers will continue on till 51, 53. But by the end of 53, all restrictions are gone. So in 47, the Canadian government realizes that completely opening the gates to foreign products, again, is not the best thing for the Canadian economy. So they create a legislation that is generally termed as the Foreign Exchange Conservation Act, or FECA. But it doesn't have the same restrictions on comics that WECA does, which allows the American ones to come in. And then by 51, it's completely repealed. And by 53, all Canadian publishers are just out of business. And we're back in reliance on American comics coming in. This does not mean that Canadians are out of it. As a matter of fact, Canadians continue to be a major driving and influential force in the comic book industry straight through until the modern day. But we don't see a Canadian mainstream publisher appear until 1975. So unfortunately, 1946 ends the era of the self-contained Canadian industry, the end of the Canadian Golden Age. I wish I had a sort of happier ending for it, but that is unfortunately the way it goes. I want to make sure I covered everything. Cool. And I'm almost on time. So does anybody have any questions or anything? Just because we are recording this and we're putting it for stream, I'm going to make you use a mic. I'm sorry. There you go.
Thank you very much. A bit, since I got my question out at the start, it's just a bit more of a thank you and everything, as someone who has been following comics their whole life and how sci-fi and comic books have like helped with my own journey of like self-discovery and identity and things. I was aware of this kind of Canadian comics boom, and I was really interested in this lecture because I didn't know how much historical material has survived. And I think you did an amazing job of filling in gaps, like all the art and things were crazy for characters I just kind of heard by name in a footnote. And I think it's really important at this time, as we see book bans and censorship and all this stuff gearing up again in the world that is absolutely affecting comic books, that for this important anniversary, having a historical lecture like this really meant a lot to me, and I'm sure it means a lot to other people out there. So I just wanted to extend a really huge thank you here on the recording for putting this all together and presenting it to us today, David.
Thank you. You did bring up something really, really interesting, and something that I'm going down the rabbit hole of research about, which is the other side of it. A lot of comic books have survived, but trying to find the background information. I stumbled down a rabbit hole of just trying to prove that Anglo-American existed, which is a really weird concept to talk about because I've got the comic book in my hand. But trying to find where they actually existed, because the building's been torn down. None of their business records. So Anglo-American, as the example, was absorbed into Synot News. Synot News has been absorbed into like 3 or 4 other companies. None of their records are available. Prove that they actually existed beyond the comic book. It was a really interesting just exercise to do. We have a lot of records from Bell Comics because John Bell is the grandson of Cy Bell. So he has all those records still. But trying to find the other 3 companies there's very little out there. I just recently found out about a cache of records in Vancouver from Maple Leaf that nobody's touched.
That's amazing.
So, any other questions, or anything? No?
Sorry, thanks, David. I was just wondering, did educational projects have more than one comic, or was it just the Canadian Heroes one that they produced?
So Canadian Heroes was the only one that they produced that hit the stands. They had a number of mail away comic type things, which were graphic novels of famous stories. So Three Musketeers, things like that. They tried to maintain that sort of educational side of it. At the very, very end, they compiled all the Canada Jack stories into a single comic book that may have hit the hands. It does have a 10-cent marking on it, but there's no confirmation that it actually hit the stands. We do know that it was available through mail away. There is the possibility to hit the stands, but as far as it goes, like for 99.9% of the stuff, it was just Canadian heroes. We're just gonna pass it back.
I'm wondering what the impact of WECA was on the newspaper industry when it comes to comic strips, that kind of stuff.
So that's really, really interesting. There hasn't actually, as far as I know, and I will fully admit that I haven't done as much research on that as I have. But what I can tell you is even in our collection, we have a number of Sunday pullout sections, the Sunday funnies, that have Flash Gordon, Superman, Tarzan, all those American characters in the London Free Press from, I think our dates are from 41 to 43. So we banned the comic books, but not necessarily the comic strips. And that to me, that also explains a lot of why Anglo-American really, really wanted the American comics up here, the American recognizable American characters. So that's a great question. And it's an area of further research that absolutely needs to be done. It's like, why was this exempt and this wasn't? Best answer I can give you. Sorry. Anybody else? Oh, no. Uh-oh.
I have an WECA related question too, and that is, you call the comic books of the Second World War WECA comics. But I know that WECA included lots of things like the list that comes to mind, two things that pop out are champagne and trading cards.
Yeah.
So if you were a champagne historian, a Canadian champagne historian, would you be talking about WECA champagne? And what I really mean, of course, is are there other industries that blew up in Canada because they were included with WECA, and therefore you couldn't import from the US?
So my criteria in that would be maybe, or my answer to that would be maybe. It depends on a few criteria, because there were a number of other like you'll have to forgive me. That F.E. Howard comic that I put up there, I actually wouldn't consider a WECA comic. It was produced during the WECA period, but it had no Canadian content, had no Canadian artists working on it. It wasn't a Canadian product. So in the case of champagne, or I guess sparkling white wine, if you want to be a connoisseur therein. If a Canadian market emerged because the banning of those things into Canada allowed it to flourish, I would absolutely say it could be qualified as a WECA part of Canadian history. Same with the trading card industry.
But do you know if that happened?
Personally, I do not. I know very little about wine, to be perfectly honest. I'm outing myself here in a second. That is a great way to talk about it. I should probably ask Mike Dove about it a little bit more, because the American trading cards were completely banned up here, and I do know that OPG was based up here. So yeah, potentially, I guess. Back over.
Actual question, not a comment this time, but I am now wondering, and it might not be something that you're aware of either, but with like modern comic publishing and things having different like IP laws surrounding them, are the WECA comic characters allowed to make reappearances in modern comics, and have they?
Yes. Well, IP law, Deb and I have had a lot of conversations about IP law and how it affects these things. So I can tell you, for an instance, Johnny Canuck and Nelvana of the Northern Lights have lapsed into public domain. A Canadian company in the early 2000s tried to revive Johnny Canuck, Nelvana of the Northern Lights, and a couple of other characters, and did so really, really poorly. So, and again, here's how we can use comics as educational tools, as a way to talk about history and stuff like that. Nelvana of the Northern Lights is also the inspiration for Nelvana Animation Studio. That's where they got their name from.
I grew up on Nelvana cartoons.
We all did. But because of that, the guy who created this new comic didn't want to use that name, even though Nelvana Studios has always said, they unfortunately folded, anybody who wanted to revive the character was more than welcome to use the name. The guy who did it revived her name as Nanook of the North. And if you know your Canadian history and stuff like that, Nanook of the North was one of the first documentaries ever done. It was completely staged and faked and is incredibly racist towards the Inuit people. So the gentleman who took one of our first Canadian heroes, an Inuit character, an Indigenous character, and renamed her after one of the worst movies to ever come out about the Inuit people, is a whole conversation in of itself. On top of that, there's actually a whole bunch of drama surrounding the copyrights and stuff with some of the characters. What I can tell you is Chapter House in 2015 got a hold of the rights to Freelance and a couple of other characters, and they have appeared in their comic books. Talking about the Anglo-American redraws, just trying to think about the copyright of those is a nightmare. Yeah, we can have a conversation about that later. But some of them are in the public domain, some of them aren't. They're hitting really close to that area, though. Anybody else? Oh, Deb's back. Then I'll expect to see if
Thanks, David. That was fantastic. I have a quick comment first, just to say that the O-Pee-Chee records are here at Western University Archives. And also, I'm just wondering, in your opinion, if you could make an academic guess, how many WECA comics are still out there? And are they predominantly just in Canada, or have you come across any pockets in the US or elsewhere?
So we do know that there are some pockets, particularly in Seattle and in Ohio, of the Anglo-American stuff that made it down there. It's really, really interesting. Sometime in the early 2000s, a bunch of American collectors found out about the Anglo-American redraws and started collecting them because they are different. So there are down there. As far as like during the WECA period, other than that brief thing that Anglo-American did, the comics didn't make them down. So the only ones that are down there are from Americans buying or Canadians bringing their collections down. We know there are about 710 individual comics from the WECA period. That being said, we used to know that it was 709, and then somebody showed up at a convention with one that nobody'd ever seen before. So it's possible. On top of that, there are comics that we don't know of. We just know that they probably exist. There's a Triumph Adventure Comics. I believe we know that we have an example of number 8. We have an example of number 10. Nobody has a photograph or anything of number 9. But we have a number 8, we have a number 10. So probably number 9 exists, but nobody's ever seen it. There may be no existing copy of it. So unfortunately, World War II stuff was designed to be ephemeral. It was designed to be recycled. There's whole advertisements in there about don't burn this comic, either give it to a friend or recycle it, so the fact that as much exists as it does today, so we have 175. The Bell collection at TMU is 189 individuals. They have more than that, but they have duplicates. So we have 175 individual, they have 100, but that's out of 710. So there's a lot. So I know there's a lot in private collections as well. But trying to access private collections is always fun. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks everybody for coming out to this. Thanks for the support. I really, really appreciate it. And yeah, we've got a really cool comic collection here at Western.